All right, welcome to our Wednesday night video. We are happy to be doing this still. I'm Chad, Scott, Blaine. We're here, and if you got a Bible, we would welcome you to turn over to John chapter 5. John chapter 5 is another one of those places where Jesus finds somebody that needs a little help and doesn't mind going out of his way to help this guy a little bit. We chose this one because I think it's got some pretty interesting parts to it that give us a lot of stuff to talk about. Just a real quick summary, and then we'll do like we've been doing. We've been kind of going verse by verse. So Jesus comes upon this place where people typically go whenever they want to be healed, and he finds this person who's not healed, and who knows, how long that's been going on. And so he says, I'm going to heal this guy. And then, just like typical, some of the folks that witness that, they have a problem with it. And Jesus is going to show them exactly why he does what he does and tell them, I think, some of the reasoning behind how that happens. So we're going to start at John 5:1, and over the next 15, 20 minutes, we're going to make it through 17 verses. That gives us like 1 minute per verse. Y'all good? All right. So, verse 1, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. Now, Scott, I think you and I were talking about a little bit of this feast of the Jews idea. What's the big idea? Why is that specific there?
I don't know which exact uh, feast it is. A lot of folks think that it is the Passover. We don't know exactly which feast it is. I think it's important to note that Jesus is often seen going to the feast. He's often seen going to Jerusalem for the prescribed feast. Jesus, I want to say that at the beginning because I'm going to maybe label Jesus as a bit of a rebel later on when it comes to healing on the Sabbath. And I think some of the points that he's trying to make by doing this on the Sabbath. Um, but it is important to note that Jesus took very seriously not just the feast, but the law of Moses. And he wasn't somebody that was there to buck the law of Moses. He was there to make a point about what it had become. And so this feast was, I think it's important that John tells us that he's going to a feast and that he's going to participate in a religious rite that they had uh, for centuries taken and used.
Right. So, yeah, you're right. He kind of gets this reputation in our world of somebody that just came and bucks the trends and says, you've heard it said this, but I'm telling you a better way. But under the law of Moses, he lived his life. There's this time when he's going to keep the feasts. There are other times when he heals the guy that had leprosy, and his first command is, "Well, go show yourself to the priest." That was what they had to do to be pronounced clean. So he's not just bucking all the trends; he's bucking the ones that need to be bucked. Right? All right. So here he is.
I'm glad I started using that word buck.
Yes. So there's a feast of the Jews. It goes to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate. They have all these gates that go into the city. One of them's called the sheep gate. I will assume they brought sheep in that way. There's a pool. In Aramaic, it's called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. And in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Now, that's verse 3. All right. So there's also, in a lot of translations, or mainly one, there's still a verse 4. It's not in my version, but I'm going to try to explain in 30 seconds why. What we have in English is a Bible that comes from lots of manuscripts and translations on down through the years. Whenever some versions were translated, they didn't have access to very, very early manuscripts. And so at some point, there was an edition that said, there was an angel that comes down and stirs the waters, and the first one to get in after the waters are stirred is healed. Well, when they started finding earlier manuscripts, they didn't have evidence for that. And so most Bibles today have a little footnote that says verse 4 or the end of verse 3 and verse 4 are not included in all the manuscripts. Well, it helps us to understand, though, because at this pool, they had this idea, common belief of the time of Jesus, was that some kind of angel comes down and stirs the waters. Not just a Jewish angel or something like that. The pagans also believed that, there was something that comes down and stirs this water. And if you can be the first one that gets in the water, after that thing is stirred up, then you're going to have a great chance of being healed. And so this guy is there with all the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed folks, and he's been, dealing with health issues for 38 years. Now, there may be something significant about that 38 number? You were talking about that a little bit.
There's an interesting correlation to Deuteronomy 2:14, where that's the length of time that Israel wandered because of uh, their inability to follow the rules. So they wander, and so this is maybe the maybe a good example of a lifetime. I think John's wanting us to see that this is a lifetime. That was 38 years was how long it took all the fighting men to die off so that the next generation could enter into the promised land. And so here John is describing this man who is he's invalid for a lifetime, not just a short span, not just a few weeks, not just some illness that has come on. Also, what this does is it shows that since this guy has been an invalid for his whole life, that just makes what Jesus does all the more impressive.
Yeah. All right, so this guy's had a lifetime of illness, and he's just been coming to this pool because he believes if I can just get in the water at the right time, I'm going to be healed. And so Jesus in verse 6 sees him lying there and knows that he's been there a long time. And he says to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Now, we've also got Blaine over here.
Hey,
Blaine hasn't
Blaine.
spoken up a whole lot. So, Blaine, what do you make of that one little question that Jesus brings up? Sir, do you want to be healed?
So I think Jesus is kind of saying, are you happy with your life? Are you happy being in your comfort zone and, just living this lifestyle you're living? Or are you ready to get out of that comfort zone and have your life transformed and changed into something new? I think this kind of shows Jesus' willingness to provide us with healing. But I think it also kind of shows that our ability to be healed is kind of dependent on our willingness to accept that offer.
All right. So, do you want to be healed? Do you have the desire to do what you need to do? And he says, "Hey, I've got nobody to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and when I'm going, another person steps down before me." It'd be great if he had like the four friends that let the guy down through the roof, but he says, "I got nobody." And so Jesus says in verse 8, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And so Jesus knows this guy came for healing. He isn't able to get it. And, we don't even read about, this guy believing yet. He's not even really at the point where we know a whole lot about his relationship with Jesus or what he knows about Jesus. But he's hearing this person say, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and he walked. Right? So great story. This guy has been an invalid for 38 years, and now he doesn't even have to get in the water at the right time. He just hears Jesus say, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And he gets up and he takes his bed and he walks, and he is immediately healed. Should be the end of the story, right? You would think. But we just keep going in verse 9. Now that day was the Sabbath. All right? There's probably something significant about that day, or else John wouldn't tell us specifically that it was the Sabbath. All right, Sabbath day was the seventh day. It's the day that God rested. It's the day they were to set aside and do no servile work and remember that God rested from his work in making the world. And so, week after week, law observant people of God would set aside this day and they wouldn't do any, strict work on that day. Now they had rules upon rules about what constituted work. They had 39 Sabbath prohibitions. And out of those 39 Sabbath day prohibitions, they said, well, can we do this? Or would I violate one of those commands? I heard pretty recently, I was talking to someone of the Jewish faith, and they had legit discussions about, the one of the Sabbath prohibitions is you can't kindle fire on the Sabbath day. All right, so if you got fire from Friday night, I guess you're okay, but you can't kindle it on the Sabbath day. And so they had legit discussions about, is it work to flip a light switch? Because really, there's fire in those lights, right? Maybe not those lights; those are pretty bright LEDs. But the old lights, there's fire in the light. And so, am I really, I can strain at the gnat and say, is flipping this light switch, is that really work? Is it prohibited on the Sabbath, or do I have to go in the dark? So they had all these Sabbath rules. And they're going to look at Jesus and say, well, you just did some healing here. And so the Jews, verse 10, they said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed." What do you think about that, Blaine?
I think when you combine the fact that this man was lame for 38 years and everyone knew he was lame because he'd been there for Lord knows how long. And you combine that with the fact that Jesus healed him on the Sabbath. I think that could indicate that Jesus is trying to prove a point or two here. And I think that point can be seen when we jump down to verse 17. I think it's saying God is always working. He rests from creation, but he's always overseeing that creation. And I think another point it could be trying to make is Jesus is separate, but he's equal to the Father still.
So this guy's been he's been lame for about 40 years, right? What's another day going to hurt? That's kind of where Jesus is, right? He's been this way for 38 years. What's one more day? Well, maybe he is doing this to make a point. And so they said, it's the Sabbath and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed. But he says, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. And if I'm that guy that's been lame for 38 years and Jesus just came and said, hey, take up your bed and walk, then I'm probably going to listen to him over these guys who are telling me, you can't take up your bed and walk. What's one more day, right? So he said, Jesus told me to do this. And they said, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn. And so there was a crowd in the place. And afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Now, Blaine, I'm gonna get back to you in just a second about that nothing worse part, okay? But Jesus has expelled the common belief during that time that somebody sinned and that caused this person to be born blind, right? They would have questions like, who sinned that this person was born with this disability? And Jesus says it's not that someone has sinned and it's caused this problem. Now, are there consequences that go with sinful behavior? Well, sure. If I go, drink a bottle of whiskey and decide I'm going to drive home and I'm a drunk driver and I cause a wreck, then yes, I've got to deal with the consequences of my actions, right? But it's not that God is stepping in and saying, all right, I'm going to levy some pretty hard punishment on this guy because he's made some terrible decisions in his life. We deal with the consequences of the decisions, not that God, causes us to deal with them, just because we have sinned. So he does say that there's an issue with sin. All right, Blaine, what do you make of that?
Well, the little part that says, let me see, what was that? That nothing worse may happen to you really makes me think back to Luke 11, starting in verse 24. It says, when the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, and finding none, it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house swept and put in order. Then it goes and finds 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of the person is worse than the first. To me, that's kind of saying, if God cleanses you and heals you, and you don't feel that void in your life where all the sin and hurt was with something that's good and godly, we're leaving ourselves open for worse things to enter our lives, and we'll find ourselves in a worse state than we began in.
All right, so I'm right there with you. I think he's also saying, look, I came to set the world right, and setting the world right means that this guy who's been lame for 38 years is going to be able to get up and walk. I'm restoring a good, wholesome creation. But it doesn't do us any good if Jesus just comes and says, hey, all you blind people, you can see now, deaf, you can hear, mute, you can speak, lame, you can walk now. If he doesn't deal with the big sin issue, right? Got anything to add over there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see time and time again is Jesus choose who he's going to perform a healing on, who he's going to encounter. We started this whole thing like 11, 12 weeks ago with the phrase contagious, I think. And is that what we went with?
It was, yeah.
Okay. And it's because what Jesus offered was contagious to them, not that he was worried about catching what they had. And this is a guy that Jesus uses to prove who he is, show that he is about doing his Father's work, which I think Blaine made mention of. And his Father's work was about restoration. Jesus didn't heal everybody. And probably, my guess is, there were probably a lot of folks sitting around this pool that day wondering why they weren't chosen to be healed. Yeah. I think it's not about physical healing. It's showing power, and it's about proving that he is the Son of God. And what the Son of God does is what the Father does, and that's good work.
Yeah.
Regardless of the day,
Yeah.
regardless of what the day of the week is, too.
All right, so let's move into our kind of final takeaway. I know I got one that's gonna that we'll get to in verse 17. So let me hold on to that one to the end. You want to start with some finals, and then we'll go from Scott to Blaine.
So one of the things that I take away from this, I like the healing aspect of it. We've got a guy that 38 years he's lived as an invalid, not able to take care of himself. He's got some friends. Maybe they're just not fast enough to get him to the waters first. My guess is when they hear the water start churning, they start running. And if you're not able to run, it's a lot harder to carry a guy than it is to run yourself. He's got friends that carry him there probably to beg, to make a living. But when he says, when Jesus asked him, do you want to get well? I almost take that as rhetorical. Of course, this guy wants to get well. For 38 years, he's been coming and laying at this pool just for the hope of these magical waters that are stirred by an angel occurring, just for the hope. And so, what he's really saying to me is when he says, I have no one to help me get in the pool, he's saying everything I've done has been fruitless. Everything I've done has led me to helplessness, hopelessness. He's still hanging on, but it all feels in vain. And so I think what we see here about the character of Jesus is that he takes somebody whose life is seized up, either in sin, as we saw last couple of weeks with the woman at the well, see somebody who is seized up in a life of religious authority, as we saw in Nicodemus. We see somebody whose life is seized up in sickness, paralysis, and even death, facing death in some instances. And we see Jesus be patient, and he's persistent, but Jesus is a freer of seized up lives. He is somebody that is going to take the hopeless and the helpless, and he's going to be able to find a cure and find a way. And I think when all those things seem to be kind of when all of my work seems to be fruitless, Jesus is the one that takes what I've done and he turns it upside down and he makes it work.
So when Jesus healed this man, there are obviously a lot of other invalids around, but the Bible doesn't mention any of them asking Jesus for healing. The Bible does mention that Jesus withdrew to the large crowds that were there, but it doesn't mention the crowds pursuing him. And I think that's interesting because the other invalids either didn't notice Jesus healing this man, or they had more faith in the water's ability to heal than Jesus' ability to heal. I think in both scenarios, the other invalids disregard Jesus and his ability to provide us with healing. And I think oftentimes we can find ourselves overlooking God's ability to provide us with healing, or we can have faith in other things to provide us with healing. So, a lot of people, they may look to other people for healing, or drugs or alcohol. But at the end of the day, we've got to, look for that healing in Jesus. And that this passage just encourages me to do so.
All right, so at the very end, verse 17, let's go to verse 16. This is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father's working right now, and I am working. So these are strange times. And for 10 weeks, we haven't been meeting in this building. We've been at the parking lot. That ends this week. And I'm thinking this is kind of like the same deal here. Sometimes people think, maybe we've thought, well, the work of the church has stopped because, we can't meet together on Sundays. Well, Jesus, I think, is pretty well giving us a clear picture here that the work of Christianity doesn't stop. These folks, the Jews, would have thought, hey, we're good on 6 days, but on the seventh day, everything stops. We don't do anything. And Jesus says, My Father's still working. And so if God is still working, then shouldn't God's people still be working? And so he says, look, God is in the business of changing lives and making the world a better place and doing away with all the wrong, broken things and ushering in all the good and wholesome and new things. And Jesus says, this is what it looks like. This guy's been sick for 38 years. He's not sick anymore. That's the work of God. And so I think my takeaway would be, hey, let's look around us and say, all right, what's broken? What's not whole? What's missing something? What is it that God would want to fix in my life or in the life of people around me who I have some kind of influence over? What is the work of God that should be happening right now, but it's not, and what can I do to make it better? A lot of folks would say, well, we don't need to touch that. We don't need to do that. That person's too broken. It's not the right time. There's no way we're going to make any impact or do any good. But Jesus says, hey, God's at work. And if God's at work, I think God's people should be at work. And so let's see what God has for us to do. And let's go do it. Now, strange times. A lot of people are taking a back seat to a lot of things right now, just like they were. But Jesus says, if God is still active and if God is still working, then I'm thinking the people of God who say we want to be more like God and we want to see God, the people of God need to be working as well. So I can't tell you, what that means for you or anybody else, but I can ask you to be more aware of it in your own life. All right, so we'll end with that. That's John chapter 5, verses 1 through 17. We almost made it in 20 minutes today. That was really, really close. So a couple of housekeeping things before we close up shop. Parking lot church or drive-in church, as we've known it for 10 weeks, is over. We are still going to offer that option at 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock this week. We'll see how many people take part in that and decide if we're going to do it at one services or two services next week. We're going to be putting out more information over the latter part of this week about what Sunday is going to look like. But just for right now, if you are someone whose last name is A through M, then you will be at church at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. We're asking you to not come early. Come in, take a seat. We're going to worship together. We're going to clear out because at 10 o'clock, we got last names starting with N through Z are going to be here at 10 o'clock. Again, please don't come too early. Come in, take a seat. We'll worship together, and then we're going to clear out to stop cross-contamination and things like that.
Yeah, I think if if you're coming to the 9 o'clock service, A through M, if you want to come at 8:45, that would be perfect. If you're coming to the 10 o'clock service, if you wanted to come at 9:45, maybe even 9:50, that would be perfect as well. So what you're going to do is you're going to come in. We've got 3 stations set up in the lobbies, 2 out front, or back, whichever way I'm looking, and then 1 out by the 4-lane side. You're going to grab your communion as you come in, and we'll have someone give you an idea of where you're going to need to sit. And we want to take our guidance from our state as serious as we can and put as many precautions so that folks feel as safe as they can. And we'll make Sunday's going to be a great day. I've got to change the sign out front to say welcome back home. Yeah. So we're glad that we get to do this again.
Anything else, Blaine? Are you good?
All right.
We're good?
Good night.
Hope you have a good night.